I'm here with composer John Link. John, thanks for being on the podcast.
Hey, John, my pleasure.
So today we're going to talk about the music of Elliott Carter a lot and composition in general. But I was wondering if you could start us off by just telling us about your coffee preferences, your coffee habits, if you have any. That's the general icebreaker for this podcast.
Okay, well, I mean, I have a bit of a story there. My stepfather, for many years, co-owned a coffee store where I was growing up, and I don't think I quite became a coffee snob in those days, but more recently I have been. I think the COVID pandemic has encouraged me to be a coffee snob. So I get whole beans from various different places, and I have a very nice Japanese pour-over coffee system, a Kalita, which I love. And every morning, and now my daughters both have gotten very interested in that.
Are you like brewing with a scale in the whole 9 yards, or?
Not quite. I sort of measure out the beans, but I don't time the water or weigh the water as I'm doing the pour over. Although there was a running joke in our household for a while that everything had to be done, the water had to be poured in concentric circles. So concentric circles it became the running joke for everything that needed to be done carefully.
Nice. I'm glad to hear that you're a Kalita person. I'm by day a coffee professional, and by night an Elliott Carter fanboy. So
very good.
I'm curious also if you could clue us in on any sort of habits that Elliott Carter had with regards to coffee.
Well, that's interesting. I don't know that I ever saw him drink coffee, although the ritual in their household was tea. And very often people would be invited over for tea, and then Helen, Elliott's wife, would make a very elaborate tea tray with little biscuits or cookies or something, or madeleines.
More tea in the sort of like English sense of tea drinking, or?
Yeah, I think so. The tea time was their ritual.
Interesting. Cool. Well, thanks for that window into your personal life and Elliott Carter's life. So let's dive into some Elliott Carter stuff. So I'm not like I don't really want to gear this podcast towards people that don't know anything about him at all. I feel like we can sort of get a little bit technical without worrying about the layperson. But I guess in terms of like the untrained ear, though, how would you characterize Carter compared to somebody else of similar chromaticism, like a Boulez?
Oh yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I'm by no means a Boulez expert, although I love his music quite a lot. But in terms of Elliott's music, I think what's most interesting about it is that it is almost consistently multi-layered. So there are almost always instruments or groups of instruments that are interacting contrapuntally. And in a way, it's not more complicated than that. It's not more complicated than the way Bach and his musical instruments will interact with each other contrapuntally. Although sometimes in the case of Carter, it's much more elaborate rhythmically, and there are sometimes more instruments. But for example, in the third string quartet, he divides the quartet up into two pairs of instruments, violin and cello, and then violin and viola. And those two groups play almost entirely contrapuntally. They very rarely have simultaneous attacks together. And the idea is to extend that conception of Bach counterpoint to texture and to musical form as well. So the two groups of instruments will have different kinds of developments that take place over different time scales and that interact with each other in all kinds of fascinating ways. So it's, Carter's music is almost universally described as complex, which I think can be rather off-putting for some people. But I've always found it to be incredibly clear from a dramatic standpoint. And that if you just, if you listen carefully and are willing to give it a chance and not run screaming from the room at the first note, then you really need almost no technical expertise in order to get pleasure from it.
So I was reading something about Carter, and he described serialism as, quote, a stultifying intellectual poverty. And I thought that was a really hilarious description. Because I mean, I don't think of somebody like Boulez, who is such a beacon of serialism, as being in any way sort of lesser. But What am I asking about this? So, I mean, I guess like he's using more like sets instead of tone rows. How do you see that as different from like the conventional serialist approach?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the Carter's relationship to serial music, however defined, is complicated and long. And I think what's often overlooked in discussions about 12-tone music or serialism is how loaded those terms were politically at the time that Carter was an active composer, and Boulez too. They were very much words that could promote or detract from somebody's career, depending on how you characterized yourself. So when Elliott would be asked, do you write serial music? His answer was not, I mean, the question was not just a technical question, it was also a political question. And he had to be very careful about how he answered, because it might send a message that he didn't want to send that would be detrimental to the cause of popularizing his music. So an awful lot of what all composers said about 12-tone music or serial music, they said with half an eye on the political ramifications. And of course, those changed over time. For a long time, being a serial composer was something that could get you a grant or a performance. And then later on, something saying that you wrote serial music was something that could get you ostracized from a concert or something else. So it's never just a kind of technical consideration. It always had that political kind of those political overtones. But all of that said, I think Elliott said at one point something like, "Those of us who write this kind of music have been aware for a very long time that the only kind of, if you use all 12 notes, the only kind of harmonic motion you can have is unisons or octaves, right?" Which is very interesting and sort of 12-tone-ish kind of thing to say. Those of us who write this kind of music. So he well understood that in working with harmonic ways of working, with harmonic methods that he used, he had a kind of kinship with everyone, going back to Schoenberg. But at the same time, his other preoccupations, or the way he applied that music, was very different from some of those other composers. And he was always exceptionally wary of being lumped in with a school of compositional thought. He was his own person and did not want to be, branded as an acolyte of someone else's system. Right. And of course, we see that with Stravinsky and his adoption of 12-tone music too. So, you always have to think about that in two ways, right? What kinds of harmonic techniques was Carter interested in, but then also what were the politics and at that specific time that might have led him to describe his music as either not serial or describe serialism, as you said, as stultifying or whatever it might be.
In terms of 12-tone music, and I feel like there's definite sort of vibe about that, like coming from Schoenberg and all of them. Could you map that onto any sort of political model? I mean, it seems very very much about the structure and the regulation of certain distributions of notes, while Elliott Carter's a little bit more intuitive, it seems. Do those map onto any sort of models of politics?
Oh, I don't know about that. I mean that I think there are political implications in Carter's music having to do with the individuality of the instruments, reflecting American democracy, or the ideal of individuals in the society, each contributing his or her own unique gifts and abilities. So that I think very much plays into Carter's music throughout his career. Whether the 12-toneness or the whatever kinds of techniques he used that have commonalities with 12-tone music, I'm not sure those have a particular political slant or political cast. I mean, there was an association that the composers who were writing 12-tone music wanted to make with with sort of evolutionary theories of so-called evolutionary theories of the arts, that serial music was inevitable. You know, Boulez famously wrote about that. And I don't necessarily know that Carter was terribly concerned about that. He did describe his own career in terms of that kind of a progress narrative of, you know, going out into the Arizona desert to write his first string quartet, and then, you know, gradually developing more and more technical ideas and refining them in successive pieces so that his music, he described his music as getting, you know, progressively better and better through his early years until he arrived at his mature style. But in terms of other kinds of politics, I'm not sure.
I feel like people, besides describing his music as complex, they always, I mean, the word modernism comes up a lot. And can you give me a sense of what that meant to him, or if he identified with that term at all, or how that, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think that term, I mean, he was always happy to, you know, once modernism became the kind of generic term that has become for the artists who came of age, you know, in the early part of the 20th century and were active in the middle of the 20th century. And well, I guess, I mean, it goes back all the way before that too. And it's, of course, it's different in different arts too. So the modernists in poetry might be a little bit earlier than the modernists in music. No, I think you know, he probably thought of modernist as a relatively neutral term and wasn't too terribly concerned about being called a modernist. John Ashbery, in one of his last poems, writes about modernism coming along historically. You know, it's okay to be modernist or something like that. You know, so you know, I think of modernism as being a somewhat more neutral term. Actually, it's sort of interesting that one of the prevailing traits of modernism is a kind of obsession with the past. I think that's true of a lot of Stravinsky's neoclassical music, for example, and even of Boulez's music. You know, famously setting out to pulverize Beethoven in the Second Piano Sonata. You know, a real concern with the past, and I think that comes up in Carter's music as well, particularly in his late chamber music, which is all for very traditional ensembles, not only the string quartet but the piano trio and clarinet quintet and so on. These are all ensembles that would have been very familiar to a composer of Mozart's day, and so, and I think Carter became increasingly interested in placing his own achievements in the context of those of his predecessors, and that's another thing I think that's probably misconstrued about modernism. That you know, the modernists are supposed to be the ones who are always looking to the future, and the neoclassicists are the ones looking at the past. But I don't really see that there was very much of a difference in terms of those composers' interests in the past. They were all taking their cues very much from the generations that had preceded them, as I think most creative artists do.
That's interesting. I feel like I've always really identified with modernism, but like in my life, I generally tend to like disregard history. Like I don't have sufficient respect for the past composers. But that's interesting that you say that he's a little bit more concerned with it. So like he was trying to build on those traditions. Like what sort of lineages would you draw this back to in terms of his modernism, like Henry Cowell?
Well, yeah, no, I mean, I think it goes back further than that. For example, I mean, Heinz Holliger commissioned him to write a piece for piano and winds, which is for the same instrumentation of Mozart's famous quintet for piano and winds, which is one of his most amazing pieces, Mozart's most amazing pieces. And then later, Holliger asked him to write an oboe quartet. Of course, Mozart also wrote a very famous oboe quartet. And Carter made reference in various kinds of ways to the earlier pieces that had inspired his pieces in those genres. And in that, he was carrying on a long tradition, right? Of course, Brahms wrote a clarinet quintet, and many other composers sort of the intermediate generations had taken up those earlier models and sort of tested themselves against them. And that turns up again and again in Carter's music. There are references to even to people like Gluck in the flute concerto. So I think also I think it's partly a function of age too. That when you're young, you're not very interested in the past. You're interested in making your own mark. And I think Elliott was too. He famously said he didn't really care very much for 18th and 19th century music when he was growing up. And then as he got older, he began to understand the traditions in which he worked a little bit better. And then, he changed his tune. And I think that's something a lot of people experience, being firebrands and their mavericks in their youth, and then gradually coming to realize that they don't have all the answers, and that there have been some pretty talented people on this planet in past years and centuries, and people whose music is worth paying attention to. So.
In terms of like drawing out the lineage the other way to people who are sort of upholding Carter's legacy these days, or like doing something in that similar mindset, who would you think of besides yourself?
Well, I'm not sure I would think of specific people. I don't think there are. I don't hear very many pieces where I think, oh, they're just imitating Carter. But on the other hand, I think just about everyone has been influenced by that conception of textural counterpoint. I hear it all the time in all kinds of younger composers' work, and it doesn't necessarily have to be in highly chromatic modernist pieces either. Also, the idea of compelling continuity, which is something that Carter always talked about, that it was terribly important to have a dramatic sense of continuity from beginning to end. And I think that's something I hear very often in work of younger composers. So I think it's pretty hard to avoid Carter's influence at this point. I think just about all young composers have come across his music, at least, and respond to it in one way, whether conscious or another, whether consciously or unconsciously, whether they want to honor it or whether they want to destroy it or work against it in their own music.
Interesting. So in terms of continuity, how does he break that down, or what are some sort of subsets of continuity?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, that changes very much. He talked about sometime in the mid 1940s, around the time of his Holiday Overture, that he began to think in terms of continuity, in a rather different way from the way he had thought about it previously. And in one sense, it means things develop from beginning to end. In other words, there aren't sort of signposts. I mean, there might be sort of passing moments along the way, but they're always encountered in passing. So there are never definitive goals in the middle of a piece. You're always on your way to something else. And that kind of sense of continuous development is in every one of his pieces, regardless of period or style, after the mid 1940s. So pieces as different as the Piano Sonata and Night Fantasies, those solo piano pieces, but in completely different styles, both have that kind of engagement with continuous processes of development. Something will fade into the foreground and be prominent for a while, and then fade out into the background as something else comes in and takes its place. And that interweaving of multiple layers in the current of time, so to speak, it becomes the dominant sort of formal mode in Carter's music. And that stays. I mean, it's realized in many, many, many different ways in different pieces, but it's a common thread, I think, in just about all of Carter's music.
And in terms of sort of the elegance of his work, and I feel like there's such structure to it at every layer, at every scale. Does that sort of have continuity baked into it, or I mean, where's that through line between the structure and the pitch sets?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. It is a paradox, right? Because I mean, it's the paradox of music, because music is continuous and yet it's written in these little dots, right?
Mm-hmm.
These discrete little marks. So I think that's something that we all marvel at, that music can be so continuous and yet at the same time it's composed of discrete events. Uh, so I think that there's that aspect of it, but there's also on a little bit larger scale, I think Carter was aware of this kind of paradox, that he was working with discrete collections of pitches, what theorists will call pitch class sets. And yet at the same time, he was concerned with continuity and dramatic change. And that's been a consistent challenge in approaching Carter's music analytically. How do you reconcile those two things, or how do you model that sense of change using essentially discrete tools like pitch class sets? And that's something I think we all sort of grapple with as analysts. But for him, it was not. I mean, he that was how he made his music. That was the methodology used in its construction. And I don't know how to describe it. Maybe you can think of something that is that's put together with individual bricks, but yet what makes the impression of something that's completely continuous and smooth once it's all finished. Like a brick wall or something. So although he worked with these discrete components and investigated them in great detail, he was primarily interested in how they could be used to create the impression of motion. Mm-hmm. And I'll give you one example. There are some interesting. I've just finished a book on Carter's late music, in which I very much grappled with this problem. How do you represent analytically? How do you represent motion and continuous change using the kinds of materials and methods that he used, that is, these discrete pitch class sets? And I found a number of examples in which he begins with something like an all interval tetrachord, one of these signature harmonies that he used again and again throughout his music. And then in the middle of the passage, a few of the notes move away from that into other kinds of configurations that are not normative or typical or these usual ones that he uses. And then gradually they'll fade into something else. Those notes will be the first glimpses of the next chord that's coming into focus. Mm-hmm. So in other words, the harmonic focus starts out very sharp and then becomes blurry in the middle of a passage, and then gradually shifts to something else and comes back into focus again. So something that Marguerite Boland calls morphing, with the analogy of the visual technique in cinema, where one face morphs into another, where we all have seen that a million times. So Carter does that kind of thing with the harmony. So it creates the sense of moving gradually from one harmony to another. And I guess that's not such a new idea. I mean, you hear that all the time in Bach's music too, for example, or in Mozart. But he does it in a way that's very much connected with his own personal harmonic style. So that's one kind of technique that he uses. And I think we're just beginning to get a better handle on that and be able to model that sense of dynamic change more effectively. In his own music, he did it as a matter of course. It was like a second nature to him in manipulating these discrete materials in order to create the impression of motion. You can think of a camera with a slow shutter speed. So, and the technique in a way is not that different. You're still setting the dials and then pressing the shutter and then developing the image or seeing the image on the back of your phone or whatever it might be. But if you're a professional photographer, you can manipulate those discrete settings to create this blur across the picture that creates a very dramatic sense of motion, even though you weren't necessarily experiencing motion as you were setting the dials of the camera. That might be a good way of thinking about the difference between the discrete harmonic materials that he was working with and the impression that he wanted to create in the mind of the listener.
Interesting. So I came across your name in the first place by reading through the Harmony book, and it mentioned that you brought in this like collection of all the different permutations of all these different sets, and it was like a list of like 1,000 different sets. And so I'm curious, how does one sort of deal with that or like that amount of vocabulary in a way that isn't like completely paralyzing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I can tell you what Carter did in the case of Night Fantasies. He became interested in this family of, they're essentially 12-tone rows stacked up as chords. So instead of one note after the other in time, you just have a chord that goes all the way from the lowest register to the highest register, one note on top of the other. And then, of course, you don't play them all at the same time. You just sort of pick and choose which ones. They're sort of like constellations or stars blinking at different times from different registers. So he worked out a family of these, and there were something like 1,000 of them. And no, sorry, there were even more than that. And these were published in an article by Bauer, Mengelberg, and Ferencz. Actually, 1,928 was the number of them that they published. And then it turned out there were some redundancies on the list that had to. So the actual number was a little bit lower, but not by much. So Carter got a copy of this list, and it was literally a computer printout from the back of Perspectives of New Music. And he simply wrote them out on staff paper with pencil and staff paper by hand. And he wrote out dozens and dozens of them. He found some that had this property of having the tritone right in the middle and then inversionally related intervals fanning out. So there's a tritone in the middle and then maybe a minor second above and then a major seventh below and then a perfect fifth above and a perfect fourth below or whatever it is. And his solution to that problem was simply to write them out by hand, which is one reason there's so many thousands of pages of sketches in the Sacher Foundation archive in the Library of Congress. His preferred method for getting to know his materials was to write them out on paper by hand. It's that physical act of writing that stimulated his imagination. For myself, I prefer to use a computer to winnow those possibilities a little bit or manipulate them that way. But it does ultimately come back to the sound. It's got to sound good. If it sounds good, it is good.
That's interesting that, to become intimately aware with all that material, I imagine writing out by hand would be helpful. But so there's no shortcut. There's no like he decided that these sets are more beautiful than these sets. Is there kind of like an arbitrariness to it?
I don't know. I mean, I think he very often had a technical starting point. Like, for example, in Night Fantasies, there's, one collection of these chords. He noticed that there were a whole bunch of them that had a major second at the top, as the top interval. So then that's a technical observation about a characteristic of this group of chords. But then the question becomes, well, what can you do with that musically to make music out of it? And so what he decided to do was say, well, we'll keep those two notes as common tones, and they'll sort of oscillate back and forth like a bird call or something. And then all of the other notes will fan out from there. And he started with the ones that are narrowest in range, and then gradually the lower ones get lower and lower while the top ones stay the same. So all of that is a kind of, it's technically interesting, but what really makes that passage so remarkable is how musically effective it is, and how beautifully fluid it is to have this sort of bird call of two notes oscillating back and forth, seemingly at random, and then the other notes sort of gradually exploring this other harmony, and then the whole field of pitches gradually expanding as though taking in ever more physical space on the piano. And of course, picking up the more resonance as you go lower on the instrument. So there, and I think that's when people asked him about, how do you think about the technique in connection with the expression, he always seemed to be a little bit perplexed by the question, because for him it was like breathing, right? The whole point of these technical observations and speculations was expressive, was to stimulate an expressive idea. And that's why, he was interested in those patterns in the abstract, but what he was really interested in was making music with them. And it's not so different, I suppose, from making music with major scales and triads. All composers have the material that they work with, and then they, manipulate it imaginatively. And that's absolutely what Carter did, just as it is what I think most really brilliant composers do.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious if you're in New York City. Are you familiar with the guitarist Ben Monder?
No, I don't think so.
Ben is like my favorite guitarist, period. And back in the day when I was in music school, I basically like reached out to him to see if I could study with him. He sent me an email that's like, here's some stuff to practice, and it was basically just like permutations of 4-note chords. And that, I feel like that email was just so potent in like, here's the possibility space of permutations. And so I'm really interested in exhaustiveness. So like, the idea that Elliott Carter had this huge list of materials is kind of interesting, because that's more than just like permuting 4-note chords.
Yeah, I mean, he worked out the set classes basically. And that's all just if you have 12 different notes, right, and the intervals that are in equal temperament. The number of possible 3-note or 4-note chords is fixed mathematically by the numbers and the relationships, and that's been well known for a century or more. But Carter worked it out himself. He worked through all of the permutations himself to prove to himself that there were 12 trichords and 29 tetrachords, etc. And he did that around the same time that there was a kind of revival of interest in set theory in the late 60s around Yale, for example, where Alan Ford and Donald Martino were both teaching. And of course, Milton Babbitt had figured that out too around the same time. They were all kind of working on these issues. And as I said, those kinds of questions had been solved already in the early part of the 20th century by a couple of generations earlier. So this was actually a revival of older knowledge. But that was something that Carter was interested in too, this sort of exhaustive, how many possibilities are there? Or, what is every possible way of doing something? And I think it enters into his compositional process. I'm less convinced that it is a key element of his pieces. I think he was always perfectly content to, once he had found all, whatever it was, 10 possibilities, he was perfectly content to leave out 2 or 3 of them if it didn't suit the needs of a given passage or a given piece. I don't think he felt compelled to include every single one for completeness' sake. Mm-hmm. I think he felt compelled to find them all to make sure he had all the possible options, at hand. But then when he actually wrote the piece, I don't think he necessarily felt compelled to use every one of them.
Do you think it would be fair to say that, like, going back to the question of Boulez versus Carter, Elliott Carter seems to have more of an organic sort of like intuitive feel about it, and maybe Boulez would be the person that has to include that set to make it perfect and complete?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't have a good working knowledge of Boulez's, the technical workings of Boulez's music, but I'm always a little bit skeptical of those intuitive versus non-intuitive arguments, because it seems to me it's always intuitive in one way or another. Right. Sure. And even the most mechanically applied system is ultimately evaluated by the composers whether it's produced something that's worthwhile or interesting to listen to. Mm-hmm. And if it hasn't produced that, then probably the composers can go back to the drawing board and find another way of doing it. But again, there was a great deal of politics involved in, when Boulez was first making his name as a composer in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War in Europe, when, there was an awful lot of money and an awful lot of very powerful forces being brought to bear on music making in Europe. So that it was all very much, I think, colored by those politics at the time. But no, I think both Boulez and Carter have a very sort of organic sense of flow in their music. Mm-hmm. Particularly, in Boulez's case, a piece like Derive 1 of that based on the Sacher hexachord, but yet having a wonderful sense of musical flow and development in a very, very transparent kind of ABA form. it's a lovely piece, and very beautiful, and the last thing in the world you would think of is systematic.
Mm-hmm.
When you're listening to it, something that's systematic it's compelling in a way, right? But it's not something you want to go and listen to in a concert, right? If the composer has a system or a systematic approach to developing material or seeing what the possibilities are, that's fine. But but that's not ultimately, that's not what the audience is going to be listening to.
Gotcha.
So I mean, it's not going to guarantee a good piece or prevent a bad one.
So I feel like we've been talking about Carter as like a harmonic composer, but like I've always thought of him as very much like a rhythmic composer. But I like to sort of say they're all the same thing, man, because they're essentially just like temporal content. So I'm curious if he had any sort of unified sense like that, where it's like, a triad is a very, very fast polyrhythm,
Oh yeah, no, I don't think so. I don't think he was interested in that, and I think probably the reason for that is that because the effects of different speeds or tempi are so different. When you're moving at the speed of the vibrations that we perceive as pitch, those effects are completely different. Or just take the example, if you have a pulse that's going at a speed that you find on the metronome, it's going to be naturally entrained, and we're going to hear it as a steady pulse and so on. If you take it much, much slower, then it becomes there becomes a point where it's no longer entrainable. You no longer recognize the pulses as being equidistant. Or conversely, you can have pulses that are not equally spaced in time, but that sound as though they are, because they're far enough apart and they're written, perhaps they're in the low register, played by a pizzicato double bass or something. So I don't think he was interested in that, the continuity of vibration. Actually, Andrew Mead, who's a theorist who's written quite a bit about Carter's music, he's very interested in that, and he's introduced a kind of notational system in which polyrhythms are notated as pitches on the staff. So the ratio of 3:2 is notated as a perfect fifth, because that's the ratio of the vibrations of the pitches, and so on. But I don't think Carter was terribly interested in that. What he was terribly interested in was in rhythmic continuity and rhythmic structure. And at various times in his career, he did different kinds of things. I wrote a dissertation about his large-scale polyrhythmic pieces that got started in the late 70s and early 80s, in which he would take a rather elaborate polyrhythm as a kind of rhythmic skeleton for the piece, and then divide those pulses, which were several seconds apart, divide them into faster kinds of streams in different ways that would interact contrapuntally in different ways. And that music is really quite fascinating because of the fluidity of motion that it makes possible. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on in Carter's rhythm, definitely.
I'm sort of curious, how would you evaluate the performance of his music in general? Because I mean, like, I know that like I'm more of a jazz musician, but I've definitely sort of witnessed classical musicians who I'm like, ooh, like I'm not sure about your sense of time here. And with music as complicated as Carter's, I'm just like wondering how well that's executed in reality.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess one always wonders that a little bit. But Carter was blessed to have a very, very dedicated group of performers who were attracted to his music and who worked very hard to play it convincingly and effectively. So I think actually particularly on the recordings of Carter's music that have been available, for decades now, those performances are generally quite good and to communicate very effectively, as he put it, things that are notated in a rather curious way. And just to give you one example, if you look at the music on the page, it looks as though it's quite syncopated in relation to the notated meter. Right. If you imagine, in 4/4 time, and then you have and attack every 5/16 notes, well, if the first one is on the first beat, the second one is going to be on the second 16th of the second beat. So it's going to seem like a syncopation relative to the notated beat. But then what you see is that every note is 5/16 notes after the previous one. So what you actually have is a steady pulse. Or a musical pulse that's got to have a little bit of give and take and rubato, as all music does to some extent. But at the same time, it has to sound as though it's a slightly fluctuating regular pulse. So it introduces all kinds of performance practice issues that you really have to be aware of. You can't play it just mechanically regular. You can't accent every note because it's supposed to be a phrase, but yet it's written in a notation that appears to be syncopated with respect to the notated meter. So fortunately, I think most performers have now sorted that out in Carter's music, and you almost always hear that done very effectively in most recordings. But it never stays regular for very long. That's the thing. So performers constantly have to evaluate, where the accent should be, where the phrase begins, where the metaphorical breath has to be in the music. And Carter almost always gives you very, very clear indications in the notation to help you figure that out. But you still have to work that out. I had a very interesting conversation with one of the members of the Jack Quartet, who are just recording all 5 of the Carter string quartets now. And he had found a place where there was a regular stream of pulses every so many notes, and then one place where it was off by 1 or 2. And he was asking, could this be a typo, or was this a mistake in the manuscript, and so on? So I went and I looked up the sketches, which are on the Library of Congress website, and found that no, he had intentionally, he had written it that way. And then of course that raises the issue, well, why is that one shorter? What's the musical expressive intent behind that? I mean, it's a mechanical fact, but why is does the phrase suddenly contract there? Is there some momentary speed up of energy in that player's part, and so on? So then you have to sort of decipher how that works, and of course you multiply that by all of the notes that there are in a Carter piece, and it's a challenge. But fortunately, I think performers are attracted to challenges, and the rewards in the case of Carter's music are very great indeed. So I think his music is in good hands these days.
That's good to hear. I mean, I guess I have insufficient faith in performance, but I'm curious, does anybody like practice along with MIDIs? Like, has anybody put them into MIDI to like sort of have a perfected execution of it to refer to?
Yeah, I think people have done that at various times, and probably the more common thing is for string quartets to do pieces like the Third Quartet with a click track. But you have to be extremely careful, because Carter's music is almost never metronomically regular in that way. In fact, in the Third String Quartet, it's the underlying conception is that one of the duos plays with a kind of exaggerated metronomical regularity, a kind of overly fastidious, like the Felix Unger of The Odd Couple. And then the other duo plays with a great deal of give and take and feeling of rubato. So it's a very complicated thing. And to try to have a click track follow that kind of ebb and flow of energy to my mind, is never terribly effective. And I've never been entirely persuaded that those performances done with the click track are as effective as those done by quartets that take the time to really learn how to do it without a click track and internalize that fluctuating sense of pulse that is, I think, to my mind, what music is really all about.
Do you have any sort of insider tips for internalizing like those metric modulations and that type of thing?
I don't. I mean, I don't perform Carter's music myself, which is maybe why I'm so why I can talk about it so easily, because I don't have to actually do it. But no, for the metric modulations, I think it's a matter of breaking it down and counting it out, subdividing it down to the common division, and then practicing regrouping those divisions into the new note values. And there's always a way to do it. There's always something that's giving that to you. He's always extremely careful about that. Very, very rarely does a speed change without something to guide it through that change in the music. And very often those changes are completely transparent to the listener. It sounds as though the change will come only after the metric modulation has occurred, because at the moment of the metric modulation, the measure before and the measure after sound identical. They're just notated differently.
Right.
So that gives you a bridge from one to the other. But yeah, I think there's always a way. If you break it down and subdivide it, you can find a way to make that connection.
Gotcha. At the end of the day, though, it's still painstaking.
Yeah, I think so. I think learning all music is painstaking. Sure. Learning to perform is painstaking. You always, Carter always used to say that he wanted his music to sound as though it were improvised in the moment by the performers. And I think that's, in general, I think that's true, right? We find it most compelling when, when Figaro really seems to be at his wit's end, with the count at the beginning of Marriage of Figaro, or where, Zerlina is really starting to fall for Don Giovanni. We want to believe that these things are happening right before our eyes. And I think it's the same in instrumental music. We want it to be taking place in the moment and seem as though it's just spontaneous. Mm-hmm. And in the case of more difficult and complicated music like Mozart, it takes a considerable amount of effort on the part of the performers in order to achieve that sense of naturalness. Right? I think of stand-up comedians, mm-hmm. who, if you've ever seen a film about stand-up, really, really great stand-up comedians as they practice their craft, you can see there's just a tremendous amount of preparation that goes into the offhand gesture, or when you look up, or when your head moves, or it's just incredible how much care they will put into crafting a performance in order to make it sound completely or seem completely natural in the moment. And I wonder if music is somewhat similar.
I remember reading that he, still into his late age, was composing every morning. Was there like a sort of repetitive practice like that, akin to the comedian, that you think had to do with the success?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, he sometimes would say that his first thoughts about something were often incredibly bad. He was mm-hmm. embarrassed at how long it took him to develop things, but I don't think that's so much true in his later years. But yeah, he did take enormous care to refine things, to get them into the clearest possible state. I think most composers do that, actually. But yeah, I think that was, in general, that was his routine. He liked to work in the morning, and then it would work as long as he could, and then break for lunch, and then the rest of the day would be occupied with other things. Particularly as he got older, right? You have limited energy and stamina as you get older, mm-hmm. And so he took that as a matter of course, as a constraint that he had to work around and figure out how to deal with. The same way you have to deal with everything else, like getting your car fixed and your laundry done and so on.
Do you think that his sort of sensitivity to rhythm, or like rhythmic complexity, impacted how he saw like circadian rhythms?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, it's so interesting. I mean, people have commented on how he was a very sort of kind and gentle mm-hmm. soul, although he had a very sharp wit when necessary, but I don't know. But people have often commented on how different a person he was than his music, right? Because his music is often very violent and aggressive and angry, or turning on a dime, and highly varied and explosive and so on. And yet he wasn't at all like that. So I wonder if it wasn't something like that. When it came to his life's rhythm and the rhythm of his music. Although I will say, he had bouts of insomnia that he wrote about, and a surprising number of his late pieces are concerned with the sunrise, which of course is also a recurring theme in the late work of a lot of poets and authors, who, because that is, if night is a metaphor for death, then the sunrise and the new day is a metaphor for continuing life and for not being dead, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's also part of it, and that aspect of circadian rhythms is quite pervasive in his in his vocal music, his late vocal music.
I feel like in trying to schedule this podcast meeting with you, I just was trying to like make polyrhythmic jokes about time and stuff, but I stopped myself.
Yeah.
So you mentioned his disposition, and I'm curious, like, what's his secret there? Because he seemed very jolly and just always in good spirits. What's the deal?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think some people are just by nature optimistic,
Mm-hmm.
and he was as well. I mean, part of that was he led a fairly privileged life.
Mm-hmm.
He generally did not want for the necessities of life, right? So he always had enough money for food, clothing, and shelter, and and didn't have to worry about where his next meal was coming from. So that gave him the leisure time necessary to write the music he did, and also possibly, I suppose, it contributed to his outlook on life. But there are plenty of people born into similar or even more luxurious circumstances who are pretty sour and unhappy. So I don't think there's necessarily a causal relationship there. And he wasn't always. I mean, he could be rather short with people, and wasn't always in a cheerful, happy mood. There was one time I was sitting with him at Tanglewood in 2008 when the 100th birthday festival was going on, and he was attending a rehearsal in the shed, and I was sitting next to him and turning pages on the score for him. And the light was not very good in the shed, and he was having trouble seeing the score. And he became quite despondent and said under his breath, I shouldn't have even come, just really feeling terrible about it. And so I signaled to somebody, could we please get a lamp or a light so that we can put it on the score? And then a few minutes later, one of the Tanglewood students appeared with an enormous flashlight about this long, one of these things that, industrial strength flashlight, turned it on and stood behind us and shined it on the score. And then instantly, Elliott completely changed, his mood completely changed. He suddenly was totally engaged, focused, and immediately started making comments about the music, quite remarkable comments that improved the performance dramatically. So he wasn't always cheerful if he had reason not to be, I suppose. Interestingly enough, the Tanglewood student who had taken the initiative to find a flashlight and bring it over and stand there and hold it for a minute turned out to be Eric Nathan, who's now quite a well-known composer in New England. And
I'm familiar.
So that was a kind of, and I asked Eric and I were trading Carter stories one day, and we both told that same story and looked at each other, and he said, "That was you?" And he said, "That was you?" And he had a photograph someone had taken of the scene of the three of us with Eric shining the light. So
that's great.
It's a small world in music.
You saying taking a picture of the scene makes me think of auditory scenes, and that's an idea that he was interested in, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of his music is in a way modeled on the late Romantic tone poems, and thinking of Richard Strauss and Ein Heldenleben is not the kind of the first thing you usually think about with Carter, but an awful lot of his music is kind of based on that. If you think about the Concerto for Orchestra and the connection with St. John Peirce's poem Winds, even though in some cases those associations came about later after the piece had already been written, or a Symphony of Three Orchestras, which was very much modeled on the idea of continuous descents of various kinds, and then connecting that with the life of the poet Hart Crane. So in a way, that piece became a kind of tone poem. So yeah, those auditory, and there's a famous quote about in which he's talking about the divided ensemble and the way he thought of instruments as characters, like characters in a play, where he does talk about that. So thinking of his scores as auditory scenarios that the players enact with their instruments. So yeah, I think that's a fair comparison. Although of course, it's always risky when you start comparing music to visual arts or to literature.
So I'm curious to get into some of your composition and I guess like your strategies, approaches, sort of like your aesthetic values that guide your work, and maybe dig into some set theory stuff as well. I assume that that's important to you in your work to some extent.
I suppose in a way, or maybe I pretend it is, or something, or maybe that's what I use to get going on a piece or something. I don't know. Sure. It's always hard to step back and judge your own creative process. But yeah, I mean, my own personal musical journey started playing electric bass in rock bands. So my first, just as Carter talked about, hearing Stravinsky's Rite of Spring is what made him want to be a composer. I think what got me going in music was, listening to Jimi Hendrix and Sly and the Family Stone and Bob Marley, and which of course is a completely different sort of generation. And then I came to classical music, so-called classical music, only somewhat later, when I was in high school and college.
What, I guess, like, how would you define your compositional approach, or not necessarily define it, but like in terms of like how you think? I mean, I'm just curious to get a flavor of how you think about composition.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think I have the same kind of experience that I think a lot of composers do, which is being very focused on the pragmatic issues involved with writing a particular piece. For example, I wrote a piece called For Irving Lapel, which is for vibraphone and guitar. And so the question there was immediately, well, those two instruments are so different from one another. How can they blend? How can they either blend together, or how can I use the lack of blend as a dramatic element? And then, okay, well, how much of their ranges overlap, and which one has notes above and below the other? And well, the vibraphone can sustain notes with the pedal probably longer than the guitar, but the guitar's got an amplifier. So there are all of these kinds of pragmatic issues that one has to deal with. And so whatever aesthetic ideas one has have to happen within those constraints, or working with those pragmatic constraints. So that's how I always begin. And I'm not sure I have a kind of overarching aesthetic. I mean, the desire is always to write something that's as compelling as possible. And maybe that's one thing that I've gotten from Carter, is the idea of dramatic continuity being the primary goal in writing a piece. It has to really make compelling sense from beginning to end, in the sense of engaging the audience, keeping them wondering what's going to happen next. So that, I think, I always try to put myself in the position of the listener who's hearing this piece for the first time, and how are they going to respond, and how can I both confirm their expectations based on what's happened earlier, and at the same time surprise them in places, and and let them be kind of in on the joke if there's something comical that happens. So that I mean, those are kind of very vague general ideas about things. But I suppose you're right. There is often there's a kind of harmonic idea, or often a family of chords, for example, that I'm interested in exploring or using in a different way. And then I just begin to experiment. I tend not to be the kind of composer who starts with a large-scale formal structure and then composes the individual sections to the spec. I tend to prefer to try out lots of different things at a smaller scale level to try and come up with compelling gestures or interesting sort of things for the instruments to do. And then at some point along the way, as I've developed drafts of various little bits and pieces, then begin to think about why I thought of all of these in connection with this piece and what that means for how they should all hang together and what kind of story they can be brought to tell. So then I begin to work out the larger scale picture kind of as I go, as I develop these smaller ideas. But not always. Sometimes in some pieces, for example, in some vocal pieces, I'll take a copy of the poem that I'm setting and do it triple spaced across the page and just start doing doodles along with certain words. Something big happens here, or a big attack, or an accent, or a bunch of little dots to have a kind of texture like like gnats in the air or something, and then try to not exactly write to that spec. It's not much of a spec, but then try to come up with specifics that will create that impression, the impression left by my little doodles. So it varies, I think, a little bit. And of course, it's very different in pieces. I'm writing a piece now for cello and two-channel audio, which has a fixed media component, and so then there are all kinds of interesting things that happen as I'm generating the audio part, thinking about how that will work with a live performer, and how the little the drafts that I make, how they can fit together, and so on.
So I listened to for Irving Lapel, and it's a wonderful, beautiful piece. And I'm curious, do you play guitar at all? Like, do you have guitar chops?
Well, not much, not really. I mean, I'm an electric bass player, so I'm used to four strings, and even I sort of learned electric bass before five-string basses became popular. So I still am more comfortable on a four-string bass. I'm two strings short when it comes to guitar. But when I was writing that piece, I do have an acoustic guitar here, so I did, everything that was a little bit tricky technically. I tried to make sure to pick up the guitar and find the notes to see what it would be like to make those physical moves. And actually what I found was I did that much more in the early parts of writing the piece than in the later parts. And then it turned out that once I had gotten going on the piece, some of the things that I did that I wasn't sure were going to work technically turned out to be just fine. Because by that point I was starting to hear things in terms of what was idiomatic on the guitar. And so that was a pleasant experience, and I think that's something again that I think a lot of composers have, who might not be harpists or French horn players, right, for example, but who develop a kind of intuitive feel for what works on the instrument, particularly as they get more and more experience.
Me being a guitarist, like I oftentimes talk about how much I hate the instrument, or I hate guitarisms. Like I really don't like idiomatic guitar playing for some reason. But I'm super impressed by people's ability to compose for classical guitar in particular and have it work out very nicely. So it's interesting. I'm
sorry, it's a very hard instrument to write for, idiomatically guitar. I mean, just notoriously difficult to. If you're not a really fluent guitarist, it's very, very hard to make it sound as though it were written by a guitar player.
Is there a way that you sort of stay engaged with how, like, the intricacies of how to write for different instruments, or do you have favorite instruments, or like, do you figure it out when you need to?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of a composer's career is determined by the opportunities that come your way and the people that you meet and the people who are interested in playing your music. So that I had the good fortune to have a close friend when I was in college who was a clarinetist. So I ended up writing quite a lot of clarinet music, and that's always been an instrument I've written for, sort of with special affection. But I wouldn't say I have favorite instruments. I think it's like asking an artist if they have favorite colors. It's there are tools in the tool, or a carpenter, which is your favorite chisel. It's kind of your objective is a musical objective, and so the instruments are, you have love and affection for all of them, but ultimately they're how you tell the story. And I mean, maybe that's a little bit misleading. I guess the sound of the instruments is so much a part of how you tell the story.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the sound of a clarinet in its lowest register versus the sound of a clarinet in its highest register,
Mm-hmm.
or an English horn in the same register, and how those things can be used to tell a story or in a compelling, dramatic way.
Mm-hmm.
And some of it is sort of tricks of the trade that you pick up from listening to different pieces and talking to different composers. You know, the very lowest register of the bass clarinet, you can overblow, I mean, not overblow, but sort of override the sound and create a very intense crescendo. And Carter uses that in the triple duo. And I think a lot of composers have picked up on that idea. I had an interesting conversation with David Del Tredici, who's a composer I'm very fond of, actually. He was getting ready to write for double bass, and he knew I was a bass player. So he said, "So tell me about double bass. Tell me about things that you can do on double bass."
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "Well, you know, you've got the harmonics, of course." He said, "Oh yeah, I mean, everybody knows about those harmonics. You want to know about the other thing, the secrets. What do double bass players really know how to do?" So there's that aspect of it too. I think composers always want to learn from instrumentalists what their instruments are capable of doing.
So when we were talking about the sheets of different sets and stuff, and how you prefer to use the computer over Elliott using like just by hand methods of cataloging, I'm curious what sort of technological stuff you use these days to aid in your composition, if any, like notation software, sort of like the practical stuff, MIDI stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I'll tell you a great story, and that is when I was in graduate school, I had a computer music class with Charles Dodge, who was a pioneer of computer music. And he told us at the time that he did everything still in Fortran, because that was what he had learned on, and he knew how to use it. And he thought of it as a tool that he used to accomplish what he was trying to accomplish. And he wasn't necessarily concerned with learning a new tool just to be learning the tool. It was the tool that was working for him that let him make the music he wanted to make. And I remember thinking to myself, oh gosh, what an old fuddy-duddy. He doesn't even want to learn C, which was the hotter programming language at the time, right? And now I find myself in exactly the same position as Charles Dodge was in then. I find that I stick with the tools that I learned years ago because they accomplish what I want to accomplish in my pieces. So, if you live long enough, you become an old fuddy-duddy. That was one thing that I took away from that experience. My methodology, it depends on what kind of piece I'm working on. If I'm working on a piece like, for example, I did a clarinet concerto. So I thought it would be fun to do a MIDI prototype of that using, synthesizer sounds. And you can really go all out on this if you want to. And there are, composers in Hollywood, for example, who do film scoring, who do incredibly elaborate things with synthesized and sample libraries of orchestral instruments and so on. I did none of that. I simply took the Garaton Personal Orchestra, the sort of, I think it was the standalone version, not the one that comes with Finale, but just the standalone version, which I had already, and I used that to generate a MIDI prototype, which I still to this day I find it helpful and interesting to use those MIDI prototypes, provided you are very circumspect about what you're hearing, because there are a couple of things that they do not give you, and one is the give and take of phrasing that human beings will do without thinking about it to make things more musical. And so it can be rather difficult to judge the effect of certain kinds of effects, ebbing and flowing of phrasing using the MIDI prototype. And I think probably the most important thing that you lose is the three-dimensionality of acoustic instruments. If you imagine you've got an orchestra and there's a a solo for the violin, for the concert master sitting at the front of the stage. And then you've got a distant horn call, coming from the horn at the back of the stage. If you put both of those into a synthesizer or sample library, they'll go like this, and they'll slam together, and you'll hear them on one sort of horizontal, or sort of one depth plane. Whereas if you hear them in a concert hall, it sounds like they're coming from different physical environments, different rooms, different geographies, one over the hill and one right next to you, and so on. And that is true of every composition for acoustic instruments. So the MIDI prototypes encourage a kind of flattening out of the musical space, which is, I think, very detrimental if you're not careful. Then for other pieces, for example, I did a percussion ensemble piece recently, and called Bonkers, because I figured the percussionists were bonking on things. So it was for Glenn Velez, who's a fabulous hand percussionist, and the New Jersey Percussion Ensemble. And there I was writing for the kitchen sink worth of instruments, because the New Jersey Percussion Ensemble has access to just about everything. So I tried to be somewhat restrained, but if you've ever written a piece for percussion, you know that when you start out trying to be restrained, the next thing you know, before you realize it, you've got the whole library of percussion instruments, thousands of pounds worth. So for that piece, doing a MIDI prototype was just not practical. It would have just taken so much technical overhead to get all of those sounds loaded in and consistent with the notation program and so on. So I didn't even bother. I just wrote that without a prototype at all. And that was an interesting experience too, because it sort of, MIDI enforces a certain kind of honesty on you, that if you're just sort of listening to the sounds in your head, it's easy to tell yourself that's what's on the page, even when maybe it's not being communicated as effectively as it might be. And MIDI will give you an absolutely unfeeling truth about how long notes last, right, and harmonic relationships and so on. But even there, the three-dimensionality is hard. If you've got a chord of 6 notes and 3 of them are played by an instrument that's going to have a totally different timbre than the other 3, then the harmony changes based on the physical space on the stage. So that's another whole other issue. But doing it without a MIDI prototype was quite helpful, because it really forced me to be extremely careful about filling in those kinds of that experience of the unfolding of the piece in my head, rather than relying on the MIDI to do it. But yeah,
I feel like towards the end of college, I was studying guitar, and I eventually started studying Max MSP, and that was sort of the point at which I was like, guitar is a silly instrument, but I've come back around to it. I'm very interested in these like simulations with MIDI and like prototyping, and so these days I'm working on a project that's like an algorithmic death metal band, basically, and I've just been simulating everything with MIDI. But I'm sort of curious, on a practical note, if you can direct me towards any sort of cutting edge music theory that would inform my set theoretic algorithmic death metal.
Oh yeah, oh boy. Guy Capuzzo has written an article about a death metal band that uses extremely, I think it's called math rock, that uses all kinds of little subdivisions.
Meshuggah?
Yeah, Meshuggah. He's written several articles about Meshuggah and their approach to rhythm, which might be of interest, just as you're thinking of algorithmic ideas for algorithms, right? And that ties into it. I guess I should say my use of technology is completely different when I'm doing one of these pieces for live instrument and fixed media, 2-channel audio. In that case, all of the audio part is composed of samples of the instrument, of the instrumentalists playing. So the piece becomes a kind of dialogue between the live performer and his or her own recorded image, which I think raises all kinds of very, very interesting questions about identity and so on, which then I try to explore in the pieces. But my methodology there is to generate things algorithmically, to generate little fragments of music algorithmically. And the constraint I set myself was that I was going to use only samples of the live instrument and not manipulate them in any way except the attack, occasionally fading into an instrument that has a shorter attack, and decay, fading them out sometimes. But I was not going to do any pitch shifting. I was not going to do any time stretching. It was just going to be purely the sound of the acoustic instruments. And what I found is even with that constraint, the range of possible things you can do is extraordinary. And so I then take those little bits of material and then they're generated algorithmically and then manipulate them into kind of collages, cut and paste them into collages so that they end up being extremely determined by my own intuitive preferences and not at all algorithmic. So there's that kind of mix as well. And also, of course, an algorithm is only as good or bad or interesting as the inputs that go into it and how it's written, right? So an algorithm is a human thing, I guess is the way I would say it.
So let me just get my head around this. So in making this piece, you're having the performer play notes and then you take that and algorithmically process it, or is there like you're feeding them notes that then
well, it's both. I mean, just in terms of the practicality of it, we have a recording session at the beginning of the process, and I just record them playing individual notes all over the entire instrument. It ends up being a rather grueling process. I'm trying to figure out ways.
But it's not like phrases; it's just like notes.
Individual notes.
Okay.
It's individual notes in all different kinds of stuff. Like for this cello piece, it was long notes, short notes, pizzicato notes, snap pizzicato notes, tremolos. So, sometimes tremolo is about as different as it gets. And then I'll assemble them all into a library and essentially write a sample player, basically, in C sound, which you probably know about. It's kind of a dinosaur now, but again, it's just like Charles Dodge with Fortran. It's what I know how to use and can work with relatively quickly and effectively. So, and then once I have that sort of sample player, then I'll go to the harmonic side and have a family of chords, and I'll look at all different spacings of a particular family of chords, and use those as the raw material that then will generate a chord progression, right? And the constraints on the chord progression are that I want to have this particular range, maximum range, and then perhaps a number of common tones, and move to a chord from that same family that shares two common tones with the previous chord, and then octaves are allowed or are not allowed as needed. And then so from that, then that chord progression is just sort of like a chorale. And then that can be arpeggiated in thousands of different ways, sometimes playing some notes together, other notes not together, sometimes only contiguous notes, sometimes not contiguous notes. Or sometimes, one chord will get going and the next one will start before the previous one has ended. So you get all kinds of different sorts of overlaps in chords and so on. And so that just generates a tremendous amount of material, as you can imagine. And so then I do an awful lot of sorting through that and throwing stuff away that's not interesting. And then take the little bits that sort of work out to be nice and flag those. And so then eventually the piece is put together as a kind of collage. And then at the same time, I'm writing the solo part. So the solo part can be things that are interesting just for the solo instrument, or they can be, in other words, they work as kind of, for the audience, they will be inputs to what happens in the audio part. You'll hear the cello play something, and then the audio part on the audio will respond in some way to that. And then at other times, the audio material will then suggest ideas for the solo part. And so some things in the solo part will arise from what just happened to come out of the algorithmically generated audio. So, and all of that, it plays into the idea of the piece of what's live and what's the human performer and what is mechanically reproduced.
Interesting.
And that's quite fascinating to think about.
Are you familiar with the music of George Lewis and like the Voyager system?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound like, I mean, it sounds like that's sort of different. Like you're more of a sort of continual process, and that's more just real time processing, or.
Yeah, I mean, I don't do real time processing of audio. In fact, I've heard a number of pieces that are quite compelling that use real time manipulation of audio that is generated by the performer on stage.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing that I sort of realized a while ago was that sometimes it becomes very difficult to tell whether something is being generated in real time or whether it's fixed media.
Mm-hmm.
And that also sort of fascinated me, because if you can't tell the difference, then does it matter whether it's one or the other?
Right.
And I mean, there's a certain attraction for doing real-time processing because of the difficulty of doing it, right? Particularly a number of years ago when it was much, much harder technically to make that happen. And then as the technology has improved and it's become increasingly, it's become easier and easier to make that happen on stage. I think it's become more and more compelling to a number of people. But I always focus on, I would only want to use that technology if I really felt as though it was necessary for the audience's experience. If they were going to, if the fact that the sounds were being generated in real time was a key element of the piece and something that would be palpable to the audience. I had an interesting discussion with Curtis Bond, who teaches at Rensselaer Polytechnic, about that. Curtis had written a number of pieces that use an electric upright bass outfitted with all kinds of force sensing resistors, like the kind that you used to see on stereo systems, where you hold your finger and press harder and it would move faster. So he had the current set up so that was triggering samples and so on. And the fascinating thing was it was generating a kind of, a hodgepodge of different sounds of all kinds, clinks and clanks and things that had nothing to do with, sounds that we associate with acoustic instruments. And it was impossible to tell by watching Curtis play what was generating what. You would see him make a hand motion on the bass, and then a few seconds later, you would hear something completely different, and you had no idea what that was part of the original gesture. In other words, the gestures were separate from the auditory experience. And I asked Curtis about this. I said, and he said, yeah, that's exactly what I was going for. That was the idea, to put the audience in that sort of state of. Now, maybe I'm misrepresenting Curtis's aesthetic in that piece, but that sort of crystallized for me that I wanted to do just the opposite of that. I wanted to make sure that that everything that the audience saw was reflected in what they were hearing, and vice versa. So that if something happens in the audio part, I want the soloist to respond to it, or the soloist to play something and trigger something in the audio part that's palpably related to what they just did, and so on. So I wanted that. I wanted that connection to be there.
Interesting. In terms of like your processing in a C sound, can you sort of break down what some of those logics look like, or like what that? I mean, I guess what the numbers are.
Yeah, I mean, well, there are two parts of it. One is the harmony part that generates the sort of the chord progressions or the chorales based on these chords, and then the other part is the actual generation of the sample playback. And the latter, the sample playback is trivial. It's just simply looking up the particular pitch number and playing it. And I mean, where it becomes interesting is the timing, of course, when certain things happen and all of the rhythmic gaps. And I've experimented with all kinds of different ways of doing that, and continuing to sort of figure out different sorts of patterns to make that more interesting. And for the harmony, again, I guess that is also not terribly complicated. As I said, it's essentially chord progressions based on numbers of common tones and ranges. And of course, the sound is going to be completely transformed by what kinds of families of chords you put in there. If you put in different spacings of an augmented triad, you're going to get one kind of result. And if you put in like a whole tone scale, you get something similar. But if you put in a diminished whole tone scale or an octatonic scale, you'll get something very different. So, and all of those are variables. So again, I think my idea is to put in all kinds of different inputs and see what's generated. And then from there, approach it the way a collage artist might, of sort of picking and choosing and pasting together things that weren't originally generated together. So in a way, it's a kind of, the algorithms generate all this material, and then my own human responses edit it and overrule the algorithms.
I'm
choices.
in a similar process right now with this death metal project, where I will make a human edit and then I try to like look back at it and be like, how can I automate that into the system already? Do you feel like you reflect on your choices and like observe like through lines between them, and like do you have something that like, do you have a sense of why you like that over other things on a theoretical basis?
That's a great question. I mean, this is something that I've discovered bit by bit as I've worked in this way. And that is that very often when I go back and I listen to what's been generated, it sounds very different from what I thought it would sound like. And in fact, I've had the experience of looking at the audio and thinking, well, this is supposed to sound very syncopated and odd. And then I listen to it. And when I hear it, particularly, I hear it metrically completely different from the way it was originally generated. So, and that immediately raises all kinds of fascinating questions about the notation and about what the human performer is going to be looking at when she looks at the part. For example, again, if you take that example of when you've got 5 16th notes and there's an accent on the second 16th note of the second beat. Well, do you want to write that maybe as 3 plus 2, 16 as one measure? Or do you want to leave it as a syncopation in 4/4? Or do you want to make that second 16th of the second beat? Do you want to scooch things around so that becomes a downbeat, right? And so I'm constantly shifting the material metrically based on what I'm hearing generated by the algorithmic by the algorithm, I guess. And then I find it becomes musically different just based on the way I hear it. And then sometimes I hear it differently than the performers do. So for example, I've had the great good fortune to work a lot with Dan Lapel, the guitarist, who's a marvelous musician with a spectacular ear, but even more important than that is he's a tremendously adventurous, creative spirit. So everything that I've written for Dan, I've written with it secure in the knowledge that if it's compelling to me, he's going to be able to find a way to do it. And it's ultimately going to be compelling to him. So I would give him segments of music, and it wouldn't come out sounding the way I was thinking of it. And I said, well, I guess what I'm really hearing is that note is the downbeat. And so then I'll rebar it, just so that this measure becomes this, and then that lands on the downbeat. And then all of a sudden it snaps into place exactly as I was hearing it. So that part of the process is enormously rewarding and fascinating, because as much as we think the computer is going to do something for us, it's our own frail human perception that's going to ultimately determine what's musically compelling and interesting. And then at that point, I'll overrule the algorithm without a moment's hesitation.
I want to be respectful of your time. I just have a few more questions that we can wrap up with. I'm sort of curious if you've seen any of these like generative adversarial networks, like the GANs and various types of AI that are generating things.
Not specifically the GANs, although I am a kind of computer hobbyist, and so I do everything from The Sims to to more recent AI networks that learn based on massive amounts of inputs. So sure, I mean, I think all of that's fascinating and has very interesting, raises very interesting possibilities for music.
Do you, I mean, I guess, like I'm wondering what sort of like possibilities you think are ahead of us.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I always think of Oscar Wilde saying, "I can predict everything but the future," right? Mm-hmm. If it's just, it really is impossible to imagine what. I mean, I read someplace that science fiction writers tend to vastly overestimate what can happen from one decade to the next, or from one century to the next, but vastly underestimate what can happen from one decade to the next. So, you know, here's my cell phone, which is a more powerful computer than the room-sized computers that were around when I was, you know, even in high school. So, you know, in that sense, it's hard to predict. I mean, well, I guess one thing I would say is that music will always be something that's meaningful to human beings. It's something that's, I think, if it's not wired into us, it's something that resonates with us in a very powerful way. So I never worry about the future of music necessarily. And, you know, just for even, I've been dismayed by the gradual, you know, evisceration of music education in the elementary schools and primary and secondary schools. But even then, I see young people coming up like Conrad Tao and like the Jack Quartet, and I'm just absolutely amazed, and not only at the technical skill with which they play, but also at the musicianship and the humanity of their playing. So I don't worry. I don't think Mozart's in any trouble. There's always going to be or Elliott Carter for that matter. That I always think there's going to be a generation. If the music is compelling, it's going to find its advocates. So that's deeply reassuring, I think. And then as far as the technology goes, AI, or if it's electronic music, I mean, I'll tell you another wonderful Elliott Carter story in the film A Labyrinth of Time that Frank Schaeffer made of Carter's music. There's a scene of Carter with Ursula Oppens as she's rehearsing the piano concerto. And she says something like, well, in 50 years, I'll tell everyone that I was studying this piece with you, you know, to tell him how important it was to get his input. And he said, oh, 50 years. In 50 years, they won't even have a piano. Which I thought was quite an amazing comment to make as you're listening to somebody play your piano concerto.
Right.
But I mean, I think the other side of that coin is, you know, there will always be musical instruments there will always be musicians. So, you know, I might not like everything. I might be yelling at those kids to get off my lawn, but I'm excited to see in whatever time I have left on this planet what the kids will do, and hope to continue to contribute to that myself. But I mean, it's the safest bet in the world to say it's going to be an exciting time for music.
I feel like you know, composition in music has a lot of like game-like elements to it, and seeing how, like, you know, AlphaGo has essentially like dominated Go, and like, you know, chess has been dominated by AIs. Like, is that something that you can do with a creative practice that doesn't really have, you know, a goal like chess does?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think that's a great question. And you know, as human beings, we've had to reconcile ourselves to the fact that our dominance in chess and Go have fallen by the wayside now. And you know, there's another one of those sort of Turing tests for music, which is, you know, are you able to tell whether something was generated by a synthesizer or by a human performer? And I saw on Facebook recently somebody had posted something from YouTube that sounded at first very much like a human being, but was in fact a synthesizer. And there was a kind of pleasure that the commenters took in being able to tell that it was a machine, not a human. There was a satisfaction there that immediately made me think of the satisfaction that great chess players had prior to the last few years. And I thought, that's a Turing test that's bound to fall at some point. At some point, humans will be able to design computers that will be able to produce music indistinguishable from the music that a human being could play. Right. And I think we better reconcile ourselves to the fact that that day is coming, and not despair, but rather say, well, what can we learn from that? How can that make us more interesting human composers and human musicians? Or how can we press those machines into service for our own ends, and to use for what they can tell us about our own lives and our own interconnectedness relationships.
Somebody like Conlon Nankaro comes to mind, and the process of making those player piano sheets was, I'm sure, a performance in and of itself. But do you feel like it's important that music is performable by humans, or what do you think about superhuman compositions?
Oh, yeah. Those Nankaro pieces are fascinating, but they are deeply uncanny for that reason.
Yeah.
You once you realize that they couldn't be played by a human being, you begin to wonder who's playing them, right? And of course, that as we've just been talking about, that is my interest in these pieces that I've been writing for live performer and audio. So clearly, that's something that I find compelling to think about, but. I don't necessarily dislike the Nankaro player piano studies. The sameness of timbre and attack quality becomes a bit numbing after a while, I think. But no, those are fascinating pieces, and pioneering. No, I don't have any objection to that kind of superhuman performance. One other thing I'll say is that. When circular breathing became extremely popular among saxophone players and woodwind players in general, I guess, but I heard it first in jazz, I became aware of a very striking phenomenon. If you listen to someone play while circular breathing, there will come a point at which you begin to feel tense and constricted in your chest, and you begin to feel a little short of breath yourself because you're waiting for the person to breathe.
Interesting.
And that phenomenon, I think, is something that's worth thinking about as you are working with those kinds of superhuman machines. What sort of story are you telling, right? And I mean, not that that's bad, but but you want to be aware of what story you're telling, right? You want to be making a point, or you want to be telling that story. You don't want it to be told without your knowledge.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we can wrap this up. Can we end with what you're working on and anything to look out for in the near future with yourself?
Yeah, sure. On the scholarly side, the Elliott Carter side, I have a book coming out, as I said, called Elliott Carter's Late Music, which is in production now at Cambridge University Press. And everything is slowed down by the pandemic, but I expect that book will be out probably late in 2021 or early 2022, and that'll be available wherever finer books are sold. And then for my own composition, I'm juggling a couple of things. As I said, I've been working on a piece for Carolyn Stinson for cello and audio. That I've run into some technical issues that I've been working on this piece for a long time, but that now I think I've got squared away. So that's one project. And then another is I've received a commission from the fantastic ensemble Counter Induction for a piece for them, and we're still sort of working out what the instrumentation will be, but that will be the next sort of large scale piece. So I'm very excited about that, and that will make it onto their season as soon as it's safe to resume performing at a date to come. So, and I guess I should plug my website, which is johnlinkmusic.com, if anyone's interested in learning more about me. And I teach at William Patterson University in New Jersey. So I'm that John Link. There's another John Link who has a vocal quartet in New York, and then another who's a film editor in Hollywood whose name pops up in the credits sometimes, to my surprise.
I will know that it's not you if I see a movie credit. I'll be looking forward to this Elliott Carter book. I'll be refreshing the Amazon page.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, John Link, thanks so much for joining me. It was really fun talking to you.
Thanks, John. It was a pleasure.
All right. Adios.
Okay, bye-bye.